The millionaire CEO was calmly sipping his coffee in his office when a little girl's desperate scream outside his door stopped the entire building, and nothing in his life made sense after that moment. Charles Bennett began his morning the way he always did, early, sharp, and uninterrupted. The skyline spread wide outside his 34th-floor office window, painted in golden tones by the rising sun. His assistant had already brought in his usual double espresso, his tie was immaculate, and the financial report on his tablet glowed with perfect numbers. It was a routine Charles relied on, a daily structure that kept his life neat, professional, and completely controlled. That control shattered the moment a high-pitched scream pierced the quiet air outside his office. He looked up immediately, frowning, unsure if what he heard was real. Another scream followed, unmistakably a child's voice. It echoed down the marble-lined corridor just beyond his office door. Charles stood and moved toward the sound. As he opened the door, he was met with a scene that felt surreal. A security guard was standing in the reception area, holding back a small girl who was struggling in his grasp. She couldn't have been more than 6. She had wavy blonde hair that framed her round face in disarray, and large brown eyes that were wide with panic. Her small fists were clenched, her voice hoarse from shouting. "Let me go. I need to talk to him," she cried, trying to wrench herself free. The guard noticed Charles and looked apologetic. "Sir," she ran past the front desk. "Says she knows you. I was just escorting her out." The girl caught sight of Charles and immediately stopped struggling. Her gaze locked on him, and she froze as if time had stopped. Her bottom lip trembled. "You're Mr. Bennett," she said softly, breathless, like she had just finished a race. Charles stepped closer, still confused. "Yes, I am. Who are you?" The girl swallowed hard and took a small step forward. "My name is Ellie. My mommy is in the hospital. She said if anything ever happened, I should come find you." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she reached into the backpack slung over one shoulder, pulling out a folded photograph. Her hands were shaking as she handed it to him. Charles unfolded the photo and felt his entire body go still. It was him, 10 years younger, arm around a woman he had not seen in 6 years. Julia. She was smiling, and so was he, frozen in a moment that felt like a lifetime ago. Charles looked up from the photograph, suddenly seeing the resemblance in Ellie's eyes, in the shape of her mouth. His heart thudded, once, hard. "My mom is Julia," Ellie said, her voice now barely above a whisper. "She said if she couldn't talk, I should come to you. She said you would help. Please, please don't send me away." The security guard looked to Charles for direction, clearly uncertain. Charles couldn't speak right away. His throat had gone dry. He looked at Ellie again and saw something he hadn't expected, something fragile and urgent and real. Without thinking, he nodded. "It's okay," he said to the guard. "She's staying. She's with me." And with that sentence, his entire world quietly, and irrevocably, shifted. Charles stood frozen in the middle of the lobby as Ellie's words echoed inside him. Nothing about the moment made sense, and yet every instinct told him it was real. The photograph in his hand confirmed it. There he was, younger and more relaxed, with his arm wrapped around Julia's waist. She was smiling at the camera, her hair windblown, and his expression, once unfamiliar to him, now stared back with a kind of intimacy that made his chest tighten. He remembered that weekend. They had gone to the coast for no reason, rented a small cottage, stayed up late talking about everything and nothing. It had been one of the last times he'd let himself be fully present in someone else's world. And then he left. He looked down at the little girl who was now standing quietly beside him, holding the strap of her backpack with one hand and rubbing her eye with the other. She looked tired. Not just from running into his office, but with the kind of exhaustion that children shouldn't carry. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, cautious but hopeful. "She told me your name," she said again, quieter now. "She told me you used to be important to her." That word, used to be, landed with more weight than he expected. He gently placed the photo on the reception desk and crouched down to Ellie's level. "Where is your mom now?" he asked, carefully. "What happened?" Ellie fidgeted, then pulled a crumpled note from her coat pocket. "The hospital gave me this. She fainted at work and wouldn't wake up. Someone called an ambulance. I was at school, and then I waited, but no one came to pick me up. So I went home, and then I remembered what she said." Charles took the paper from her and scanned it. It was a discharge summary from the emergency room, signed with Julia's name and an urgent message scribbled at the bottom: "If anything happens to me, find Charles Bennett." There was an address and nothing else. It didn't explain what she had, how bad it was, or who had been watching Ellie in the meantime. And the worst part was, she had apparently trusted that he, someone she hadn't spoken to in years, would step up. He stood and looked at the guard, who was now clearly uncomfortable. "Tell Elise to clear my afternoon," Charles said, his voice calm but firm. "And have the car brought around." The guard hesitated. "Sir, are you sure?" "Yes," Charles cut in, gently placing a hand on Ellie's shoulder. "We're going to the hospital." Ellie didn't say anything on the elevator ride down. She stayed close to his side, holding her bear-shaped keychain in both hands. Charles glanced at her more than once, trying to understand how he could have possibly missed this. Julia had been gone from his life for 6 years, and in that time she had carried a child, raised her, protected her, and never once reached out. Why? Was it pride? Pain? Or had she simply assumed he wouldn't care? When the car pulled up to the emergency entrance of St. Mary's Hospital, Charles helped Ellie out and led her inside. The woman at the reception desk looked up and blinked in surprise when she saw him. He was used to that, his face occasionally appeared in the business news, but this wasn't a boardroom. He explained who he was, gave Julia's full name, and waited as the woman tapped at her keyboard. "She was admitted this morning," she confirmed. "Internal bleeding. She's in observation. No visitors allowed yet except family." Charles hesitated. He didn't know if he had the right to say it. But then Ellie stepped forward and whispered, "He is family." The receptionist paused for a long moment, then nodded slowly and gestured toward the waiting area. "Take a seat. A nurse will update you when she's stable." Charles led Ellie to one of the plastic chairs and sat down beside her. She curled up next to him, hugging her backpack, her legs drawn to her chest. He looked at her again, really looked. The way she tilted her head, the curve of her mouth when she frowned, even the small, focused crease between her brows, all of it reminded him of Julia. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about quarterly targets or investor calls or mergers. He was thinking about a woman he'd once loved, and the child he never knew he had, now asleep against his side. Charles sat silently in the waiting room, the noise of hospital monitors and intercom announcements distant and muffled compared to the weight of the child leaning against his side. Ellie had fallen asleep, her head resting just below his shoulder, her small body curled in a way that told him she'd done this before, waited, worried, endured in silence. He kept his arm gently around her, unsure if it was for her comfort or his own. The sterile white walls, the scent of disinfectant, the ticking clock on the far wall, everything reminded him that this wasn't just a detour in his day anymore. This was something irreversible. Something he couldn't walk away from, even if he wanted to. A nurse finally approached with cautious steps and a clipboard hugged to her chest. She glanced down at Ellie before addressing Charles quietly. "You're listed as emergency contact," she said. "Ms. Davis is stable. She regained consciousness about 20 minutes ago. She's still weak, but coherent." Charles exhaled without realizing he'd been holding his breath. "What happened?" The nurse hesitated. "There's a history of untreated anemia. She collapsed at work. She lost a lot of blood before paramedics arrived. We're giving her transfusions now, and we'll keep her overnight for monitoring. She was lucky her daughter didn't panic. Her eyes flicked briefly to Ellie, still asleep. That little girl kept calm, remembered your name and address. That's not nothing. Charles nodded slowly. The nurse led him down a hallway while another nurse stayed with Ellie. With every step toward the recovery room, he felt the weight of old choices pressing harder against his spine. The last time he had seen Julia, there were no dramatic goodbyes, no tears, just a final disagreement and an unspoken understanding that their lives were heading in different directions. She had been disappointed, yes, but she hadn't begged. And he had assumed that silence meant closure. Now he realized it had been something else entirely. When he stepped into her room, the light was low and Julia looked impossibly small in the hospital bed. Her skin was pale, her hair disheveled against the pillow, but her eyes were the same, sharp and steady and unafraid. She looked at him and didn't speak right away. For a moment, they just studied each other as though trying to account for 6 years in a single glance. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said finally, her voice hoarse but clear. Ellie said she found you. I didn't think she'd remember the name. Charles stepped closer to the bed, unable to form words. She said I'm her father, he said at last, more a question than a statement. Julia gave a slow nod. She's 6. I found out I was pregnant not long after we split. I didn't call you because I didn't know if you'd want to know. You were already gone. Her eyes didn't accuse him. They just told the truth. I should have known, he said quietly. I should have asked. I should have, Julia shook her head slightly. There's no point going backward. You're here now. That's what matters to her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There were too many missing pieces, too many years to fill in. But Charles felt something settle inside him, something raw and painful but honest. She's incredible, he said. Smart. Brave. She showed up at my office like she was on a mission. Julia smiled faintly, a flicker of pride in her tired expression. She is brave. She gets that from me. Then, softer, but she watches people the way you do. Charles pulled the chair closer to the bed. What happens now? He asked. What do you need? Julia looked at him, not just as an old love or a past mistake, but as a man who was trying to show up, finally. Right now, I need to rest. And Ellie needs someone to take her home and make sure she eats something that isn't vending machine food. Charles stood and nodded. I can do that. He started toward the door, but paused. I'd like to be part of her life. I don't know how to do this. But I want to learn. If you'll let me. Julia looked at him a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet breath, she said, then don't just say it. Show it. As he walked back down the hall to find Ellie, Charles felt the weight of that final sentence settle into his bones. Not a challenge. A chance. A doorway he had never opened before. And this time, he didn't intend to close it. Charles returned to the waiting area to find Ellie still asleep, curled on the chair with her jacket as a makeshift blanket and her small backpack clutched to her chest like a shield. He sat down quietly beside her, watching the rise and fall of her breath, struck by how peaceful she looked despite everything she'd endured in the last 24 hours. It amazed him that she had navigated a crisis most adults would crumble under, guided only by a name and a photograph. That strength wasn't just a product of survival, it was clearly something Julia had instilled in her. After a few minutes, Ellie stirred. Her eyes blinked open, still cloudy with sleep, and when she saw him sitting beside her, she didn't jump or question it. She simply said, "Is she okay?" Charles nodded slowly. "She's awake. The doctors are taking care of her. She asked me to take you home and make sure you eat something better than hospital snacks." Ellie seemed to consider that, then sat up and rubbed her eyes. "Do you know how to make pancakes?" she asked. The question surprised him. He expected tears or silence, not breakfast requests. "I haven't made pancakes in a while," he admitted. "But I'm willing to try if you'll supervise." On the drive to her apartment, Ellie stared out the window, quiet but calm. She wasn't afraid of him, and that surprised Charles more than anything. She didn't treat him like a stranger. In fact, her presence had a natural ease to it, as if she had somehow already decided that he belonged in her world. At a red light, he looked over and asked, "Do you want to talk about what happened today?" Ellie shrugged. "Not really. Mom gets sick sometimes. This one was just worse." There was no drama in her tone, just the matter-of-fact voice of a child who had learned how to live through uncertainty. He nodded and let the silence return. Her apartment was small, clean, and filled with signs of a life built on effort. There were drawings on the fridge held up with mismatched magnets, a pair of rain boots by the door, a couch that looked older than Ellie but clearly loved. He helped her unpack her bag, found cereal in the cupboard and milk that hadn't expired, and managed to scramble some eggs. She insisted on setting the table, even though it was just the two of them, and then asked him questions between bites: how old he was, what kind of car he drove, whether he liked dogs. It was surreal. She didn't ask about why he hadn't been there, at least not yet, but he knew that question would come. For now, she was trying to understand him in pieces, one small curiosity at a time. After lunch, Ellie pulled out a box of puzzles and invited him to help. They sat on the floor, arranging corners and edges, working quietly but side by side. It wasn't just about the puzzle. It was about time, about space, about testing whether he would stay. When the final piece clicked into place, she smiled and said, "That was faster than when I do it alone." Charles felt something warm spread through his chest. "Everything's easier when you have someone helping you," he replied. She nodded and leaned back on her hands. "Mom says that too." As the afternoon light shifted through the windows, Charles helped her pack an overnight bag to bring back to the hospital, along with one of her favorite books and a small stuffed bear with a worn-out ribbon. He asked if she wanted to go back with him to see her mom again. She hesitated, then nodded. "But only if you promise to hold my hand in the elevator. I don't like the beeping sounds." He held out his hand without a word. She took it and didn't let go. That evening, when they stepped into Julia's room again, Ellie ran to her mother's side and climbed into the chair beside the bed. Charles stood back at first, watching them, but Julia motioned for him to come closer. She looked tired but stronger, her skin no longer as pale, her eyes clearer. "You did okay today," she said softly. He didn't smile, but he felt her words settle into something inside him he didn't know had been empty. "We did okay," he said. Then he looked down at Ellie, her hand wrapped around Julia's fingers and the other still loosely holding his. He realized that this wasn't just one day of stepping in. It was the beginning of staying. And for the first time in years, he didn't want to be anywhere else. The following days unfolded in a way Charles hadn't anticipated. What began as a single act of responsibility had grown into something deeper, something he couldn't compartmentalize or schedule around. Julia remained in the hospital under observation, her condition steadily improving but still requiring rest. With no close relatives nearby and her closest friend out of state, Charles became the person responsible for Ellie, not just legally, but emotionally. And surprisingly, he didn't resist it. He embraced it with a quiet determination, although everything about it felt new and unsteady. Ellie had returned to her usual routine of school during the day, but now Charles was the one picking her up. The first morning he tried, he arrived 10 minutes early, unsure of where to stand or what to say. He stayed near the gate, watching other parents chatting, greeting each other with the comfort of repetition. He felt out of place, an outsider who wore his confusion behind an expensive coat and polished shoes. But then Ellie spotted him from across the playground, ran toward him with her backpack bouncing behind her, and smiled like seeing him there was the most natural thing in the world. That smile grounded him more than any boardroom ever had. Back at Julia's apartment, he began adapting to the rhythms of life with a child. Mornings were filled with cereal spills, missing shoes, and debates over which cartoon should be playing in the background. Evenings were slower, homework he didn't understand but tried to help with anyway, simple dinners made together with more laughter than accuracy, and stories read aloud with voices that made Ellie giggle until she fell asleep with her cheek against his arm. The simplicity of the routine became sacred. Each moment stitched into his day a clarity he hadn't known he needed. At night, once Ellie was asleep, Charles would sit in the living room and go through emails, but he no longer answered most of them. He paused at messages from board members or investors, sometimes typing replies only to delete them. For the first time in his life, work didn't feel urgent. What felt urgent was whether Ellie had remembered her lunch for school, or if Julia's chart showed improvement, or if Ellie's stuffed bear, which she now insisted Charles tuck into bed, had been fluffed properly. He visited Julia each evening after dinner, bringing Ellie with him unless she was too tired. Each visit felt less awkward than the last. Julia watched him carefully in those moments, not just with curiosity but with cautious trust. They spoke about practical things at first, Ellie's bedtime, medications, bills, but eventually, the conversations drifted. She asked him about his company, and he told her honestly how hard it was to concentrate. He asked her what she planned to do when she got home, and she admitted she hadn't thought past tomorrow. There was no pressure in their words, no weight of needing to define what this new shape between them was becoming. But it was becoming something. That much was clear. One night, as Charles and Ellie were leaving the hospital, she reached for his hand without being prompted. As they walked to the car, she said, "Mom says I'm brave, but I think you're learning to be too." He stopped walking for a moment, taken off guard by the simplicity of her words. Then he squeezed her hand gently and nodded. "I think you might be right." She grinned, swinging his hand slightly, as if that settled the matter completely. Back at the apartment, after Ellie had fallen asleep and the dishes were cleared, Charles sat in the dim light of the kitchen and thought about everything he'd built in his life that now seemed so far away. His penthouse, his board meetings, his title, all of it paled in comparison to the quiet peace of brushing Ellie's hair back before bed, or the half-smile Julia gave him whenever he made her laugh. He realized he hadn't just stepped into their world. He had been welcomed into it. And now he couldn't imagine walking away. The sixth morning began with rain. A steady, drumming kind that tapped gently against the windows of Julia's apartment and made the world outside look softer, quieter. Inside, the living room was filled with the scent of cinnamon toast and the sound of Ellie's feet hopping between tile patterns on the floor, pretending they were stepping stones over lava. Charles stood at the kitchen counter pouring orange juice, wearing a wrinkled white shirt and mismatched socks, and for the first time in his adult life, he didn't care that he looked disheveled. He was beginning to understand that there was a kind of power in being present rather than polished. When Ellie sat down at the table, she asked if she could visit her mother again after school. Charles said yes without hesitation. He had already planned to pick her up and drive straight to the hospital, even before she asked. The way Ellie checked her backpack twice before leaving, the way she tucked her small sketchbook inside to show her mom a new drawing, it was clear she had built her week around those short hospital visits. He understood now that consistency was more important than perfection, and that being there, every day, mattered more than any apology could. After he dropped Ellie at school, Charles sat in his car longer than usual, his hands still on the wheel, thinking about Julia. Her condition had stabilized enough that doctors expected her to be discharged in a few days. The news should have brought relief, but instead, it stirred a storm of uncertainty inside him. He knew she would need help, real, ongoing help, not just rides to appointments or meals reheated from frozen trays. She would need rest, support, and most of all, someone she could rely on without question. He had never been that person before. But he wanted to be now. Later that day, after picking up Ellie and grabbing her favorite cookies from a nearby bakery, they arrived at the hospital just before sunset. Julia was sitting up in bed when they entered, pale but smiling. Her hair had been washed and combed back, and though her frame still looked fragile beneath the hospital blanket, there was color in her cheeks again. Ellie climbed onto the edge of the bed and pulled out her sketchbook, talking so quickly about her school day that the words nearly tripped over each other. Julia listened, her hand resting gently on her daughter's knee, nodding, laughing softly, occasionally glancing at Charles with a kind of quiet gratitude. After Ellie ran down the hall with a nurse to grab a juice box, Charles sat in the chair beside Julia's bed. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds. Then she turned toward him and said, "You've done more than I expected." Her voice wasn't accusing, but honest. "You didn't owe us anything. You didn't even know she existed." Charles looked at her, steady and certain. "Maybe I didn't owe you something in the past," he said carefully. "But I do now. And it's not because I feel guilty. It's because this, being with her, helping you, it's the only thing that's made sense in years." Julia watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "I don't know how to rebuild something that never really existed," she said softly. "I don't want to confuse her, or myself. I don't want to pretend like time didn't pass." "We can't rewrite what happened," Charles replied. "But maybe we can write something new. If you let me." He expected resistance, some wall to go up, but instead Julia sighed and leaned her head back against the pillow. "It's not just about letting you. It's about trusting you. Not just when things are convenient, but when they're hard." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll show you, every day, that I mean it." Just then, Ellie ran back into the room, juice box in hand and cheeks flushed with excitement. She plopped into the chair between them and announced, "Mom says I can teach you how to braid hair." Charles blinked, surprised, and Julia laughed. "I may have mentioned your styling skills need some work." Charles raised both hands. "Fair enough. I'll accept the training." That night, as they left the hospital, Ellie asked if he would still be there when her mom came home. Without hesitation, he said, "I will." And when she slipped her hand into his as they crossed the parking lot, he felt it again, that quiet, powerful shift inside him. The kind that didn't make noise, but changed everything. 3 days later, Julia was discharged from the hospital. The morning was bright and cloudless, a quiet contrast to the uncertainty that had shaped the past week. Charles had made sure everything at the apartment was ready, fresh sheets on the bed, groceries in the fridge, and medications picked up and sorted neatly into a pill organizer. He even fixed the flickering light in the hallway, something Julia had apparently been ignoring for months. He wasn't trying to impress her. He simply wanted her to come home and feel like she could rest. Not like she had to return to survival mode. Ellie was waiting at the front door when Charles brought Julia home. The little girl bounced on her toes with nervous energy, wearing a crown made of paper and glue, which she insisted was to welcome her queen. When the door opened and Julia stepped inside, slower than usual but smiling, Ellie ran to hug her, wrapping her small arms gently around her waist. Julia closed her eyes and held her daughter close, her expression softening in a way Charles hadn't seen before. It was the kind of reunion that was quiet, not dramatic, but filled with all the emotion they hadn't let themselves feel earlier. Julia took slow steps through the apartment, reacquainting herself with her own space, and seemed surprised by how much it already looked and felt like more than a place to sleep. There were little changes, blankets folded differently, dishes rearranged, Ellie's drawings framed on the wall in simple dollar store frames. "You did all this?" she asked, glancing over at Charles. He nodded, almost sheepishly. "I figured you shouldn't come home to chaos." She didn't say thank you out loud, but the way she looked at him said enough. That first night was different. Charles stayed late, helping Julia get settled while Ellie insisted on making dinner. Dinner, in her case, meant peanut butter sandwiches cut into star shapes, carrot sticks, and juice poured carefully with both hands. They sat at the table together, 3 people who had once been strangers now forming something tentative and real. There were moments of silence, but none of them were uncomfortable. It felt like breathing had become easier for all of them, like some invisible thread had pulled them into alignment without anyone needing to force it. Later that evening, Charles offered to read Ellie her bedtime story while Julia took her first proper shower in days. Ellie chose a book about a magical forest and climbed into bed with her stuffed bear tucked beneath one arm. As he read, she interrupted with questions, half of which didn't relate to the story, but he answered each one anyway. When the book ended, she turned to him and said, "Are you going to stay tomorrow too?" He hesitated for just a second. "If it's okay with your mom," he replied. She nodded, satisfied. "I think she wants you to." Then she reached up and touched his cheek in a way that was unguarded, trusting. "You're a good reader," she said, before curling into her pillow and closing her eyes. Charles sat there for a while, watching her breathe, thinking about how strange it was to love someone so quickly and so deeply that it frightened you. But he didn't pull away. He stayed until her breathing grew steady. When he stepped out of Ellie's room, Julia was sitting on the couch in fresh pajamas, hair damp, a cup of tea between her hands. She looked rested, but wary. Charles joined her without asking. They sat in silence again, but it was the kind that invited honesty. Finally, she spoke. "You've changed. You listen more. You're not always looking past the moment like you used to." Charles looked down at his hands. "I had to lose a lot before I realized what mattered. But even when I had everything, I felt like something was missing. Now, for the first time, I don't." Julia studied him for a moment, then took a sip of her tea. "I don't know what this is between us. I'm not ready to name it. But I do know that Ellie needs you. And I need you too. In a way I didn't expect." Charles met her eyes. "Then let's not rush to name it. Let's just build it. One piece at a time." She nodded slowly. "Okay." That night, Charles didn't go back to his penthouse. He slept on the couch, blanket over him, Ellie's stuffed bear sitting on the coffee table like a silent guardian. And when morning came, with the smell of toast and laughter from the kitchen, he woke up to something he hadn't known he craved, a life that wasn't perfect, but finally felt like home. A month passed, and life settled into a rhythm none of them had expected but all of them quietly embraced. Charles no longer kept his phone on during dinner. He stopped checking emails before bed. His team had adjusted to his reduced presence at the office, and though some questioned his shift in priorities, most understood that something in him had changed. And not in a scandalous, dramatic way, but in the way a person begins to show up for their life instead of racing past it. He still worked, still made decisions and took calls, but his hours were shorter, his boundaries firmer, and his evenings reserved for something far more important than boardrooms. Julia's recovery progressed steadily. The color returned to her face, her movements grew stronger, and she started taking walks with Ellie after school. She and Charles often stood together at the window, watching Ellie skip ahead on the sidewalk, talking to herself, the way kids do when they feel safe. Sometimes Julia would glance at Charles with that quiet smile she gave only when she thought he wasn't looking. And sometimes, he caught it anyway. They didn't talk about what they were, or what they might become, because there was something sacred about the way things were unfolding without labels. They lived in the moment, careful not to break the fragile trust that had taken so long to rebuild. One Saturday afternoon, they visited the park together. Ellie insisted on a picnic, packing sandwiches she helped make and lemonade she poured into mismatched cups. She brought her sketchbook too, and halfway through lunch, she handed Charles a drawing. It showed 3 figures again, this time clearer. A tall man, a woman in a red dress, and a girl holding both their hands. Above them, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "My family." Charles blinked hard, looking at the paper longer than necessary. Julia reached over and gently squeezed his hand beneath the blanket. It was a simple moment, but to him, it felt monumental. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting golden streaks through the trees, Ellie ran off to chase a butterfly. Julia and Charles stayed on the blanket, the silence between them full but unspoken. Finally, she leaned her head on his shoulder. It was the first time she'd touched him like that since the hospital. No discussion. No warning. Just quiet closeness that meant more than any speech could. He placed his hand over hers. No promises, no dramatic declarations, just presence. Commitment without pressure. He would stay. He already had. That evening, as they walked home, Ellie held both of their hands. She looked up at Charles and asked, "Do you think we'll always be like this?" He looked down at her and smiled softly. "I hope so," he said. "And I'll do my best to make sure of it." She seemed satisfied with that answer, skipping ahead again. When they got home, Ellie ran to her room to change into pajamas while Julia and Charles cleaned up the last of the picnic leftovers. In the kitchen, surrounded by crumbs and the fading smell of peanut butter and lemonade, she turned to him and said, "I don't think I could have done this without you." He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Maybe you could have. But I'm grateful you didn't have to." She nodded, eyes glistening, and leaned in to kiss his cheek. That night, after Ellie was asleep and the apartment had quieted, Charles stood in the hallway between her bedroom and the living room. He looked at the home around him, the toys on the floor, the half-folded laundry on the couch, the list of groceries pinned to the fridge, and felt a kind of peace he hadn't known was possible. It wasn't flashy or perfect. It wasn't the kind of success he could measure with numbers or praise. But it was real. And it was his. He didn't need the title or the corner office or the endless chase anymore. What he needed was here. In this home. With them. A place not defined by what he had left behind, but by what he had finally decided to hold on to. In the end, this story isn't about a millionaire or a grand twist, it's about quiet redemption, the kind that doesn't come with applause but with presence. What moved me most was how Charles didn't fix everything with money or grand gestures, but by simply showing up, staying when it was uncomfortable, and allowing himself to be transformed by connection. He didn't reclaim a past, he built something entirely new. And perhaps that's the most powerful kind of healing, not erasing the mistakes, but choosing, day by day, to be better than them.